Alright, so here we have a match between True Play 8 and XPodric. True Play 8 is white, XPodric is black. And we begin the game with e5. It's a pretty standard opening. Black responds by playing knight h6. Not a move that you would typically see. Generally speaking, against e5 you would more likely, or against e4 rather, you would see something like e5 or e6 or c5, the Sicilian. White continues to develop with d3. Now that bishop is attacking the knight, so if black were to play something like e5 now, then white could take, and then black would be forced to take back with the pawn, which is not ideal because it ruins the pawn structure, and it essentially forces the king to castle along the queen side. So now we have d6, potentially setting up an e5 move, or even a bishop to g4 attacking the queen, assuming that the bishop does not take the knight. Then you could develop the bishop to g4 and it would be protected by the knight. We now get d4. A bit of an unconventional opening for white. Typically speaking, if you wanted to develop to the d4 square with the pawn, you would play it initially instead of just playing d3. But perhaps they were a little bit worried about what would happen, and now we do in fact see bishop g4. Once again, this bishop is protected by the knight. So what will white do? There are a few options. Knight f3 is one of them. Develops the knight. Moves one step closer toward the king castling on the king side. But there is still the pin threat. This knight cannot be moved without losing the queen. Now we see black playing c5. I believe this is generally referred to as a Caro-Kann structure. If white were to play d5, that would be the advanced Caro-Kann. But instead they play bishop e3, and black immediately responds with queen a5, check. Once again, there are a few options for white. They could either develop the knight, push the pawn, or move the bishop back. If they wanted, they could even move the queen up to block. I would say moving the bishop back would be an okay move. The only unfortunate thing is that it undevelops the bishop from the square, and it would also leave the d4 pawn unprotected. But they don't do that. White instead plays knight c3. Black responds with knight c6, a mirrored move. We can see there's a lot of tension building in the center. We have both of white's knights developed as well as black's knight, and these pawns are eyeing each other down. What will white do? Will they continue to develop and move towards castling? They will. Bishop b5. Now, black is able to castle whenever they choose. And there are a lot of pins going on in the position. Once again, bishop g4 is pinning the knight to the queen, and bishop b5 is pinning the knight to the black king. Black plays a6, trying to push out that bishop. What will white do in response? They could of course take the knight, and the only way to take back would be b takes on c6. It would ruin a little bit of black's pawn structure, but at this stage in the game, it wouldn't be the end of the world. The main difficulty, though, I would say for black, is their inability to develop this black bishop. And now, bishop to d3 is a blunder, according to the engine. The reason why, perhaps not entirely clear. My best guess would be knight to b4. Doesn't essentially make sense. Oh, and of course, there it is. C takes on d4. This forks both of white's pieces, the bishop on e3 and the knight on c3, and it is protected by this knight on c6. White decides to trade the pawn back, which makes sense. Now black takes the bishop, and this knight is under continuous threat. Now it is being attacked by two pieces. After white castles, black takes, and the pawn takes. And now this position is looking very dangerous for white. White's king is left wide open along this file, the G file. So if black were to start pushing these pawns after moving this knight out of the way, they could potentially develop their rook, swing their queen over, could lead to a devastating attack. Black retreats the bishop, of course not wanting to lose it. Bishop e6. And now this queen can come on over whenever it wishes. And we see f4 actually prevents the queen from developing it right at this moment. So not a terrible move. Additionally, this knight on c3 is no longer pinned by the queen because the king has moved out of the way. Now we see rook c8, developing this rook, potentially trying to set up for an attack. Once again, I would like to highlight this bishop on f8. Very difficult to develop it. The bishop on e6 is actually preventing the e7 pawn from moving, and so the only way to develop it at the moment would be to move the g7 pawn. But now, f5, it actually allows the bishop to move out of the way without losing a tempo necessarily, but instead, knight takes on f5. After pawn takes, bishop takes, and now black has actually traded back some pieces. At the same time, though, important to note, even if white takes back on f5, the queen is actually able to recapture. So it's not just a hanging piece there. Also, after these moves, the pawns are moved out of the way, which leaves white once again open for an attack from black's queen after potentially swinging over, maybe with some pawn backup, maybe developing this bishop. Still a dangerous position for white, even though some pieces were traded back. And even if the attack does fall through, black is still up 2 pawns. What will white do? White plays b4. This is an interesting move for a few reasons. One, black cannot simply take the pawn because otherwise their bishop will be hanging. Well, actually they could, but if they do take it, the bishop will be hanging. At the same time, though, the b4 pawn was at b2 protecting this knight on c3. So now we're in a very interesting position where we could have bishop takes and rook takes. Now, funnily enough, the engine actually said that white had a very winning move there that was not bishop takes on f5. I'm not quite sure exactly what the move was. I imagine it would be something with either moving the knight to safety or moving the queen, setting up an attack. Either way, the moment has passed. Now black is simply in a winning position. Once again, up 2 pawns, and white's king is open. So there could be some deadly tactics coming soon. It also does not help that white, despite being down in the position, is also down on the clock. That will be important to keep in mind for later positions. Additionally, this b4 pawn is still hanging. Queen e1, attacking this rook, but if black simply plays queen takes on b4, then the rook will be protected. At the same time, though, that could lead to a pin. The rook would not be able to move because then the queen could simply be taken. So we'll see how black decides to proceed. Is taking the pawn safe, or does moving the rook need to come first? Black plays g6, leaving this bishop open to develop, but also leaving a piece hanging, which is not ideal. And in fact, if this move is played, this rook would also be under attack. So if white sees this, and they don't, they decide to retreat the bishop, worried about the trade back, but now black has a second chance to retreat or protect their rook. And there we go. Bishop g7, developing the bishop, allowing black to castle, also defending this rook. We now see rook b1. Putting further pressure or defense on that pawn, rather, considering it was undefended before. But this could be a precarious situation for black. If they misplay slightly, they could end up in a losing position. Once again, this rook is under attack and its only defender is the bishop. The bishop is currently glued to the rook, so it isn't entirely clear how to respond. Now black plays bishop to d4. Still maintaining the protection of the rook on c3, but also maybe setting up for an attack on this f2 pawn. Obviously, it is currently defended 3 ways, but perhaps in the future. Additionally, important to note, this rook is trapped. It cannot move as a result of the pawn, queen, and king, leaving it stuck there on f1. But now we see a3, and that pawn is not protected, so black decides to take it, and now the rook is safe. It is no longer under attack by the queen. Still though, this pawn cannot be taken by black. It is protected 2 ways, by the rook and the queen. So we'll see how black continues to develop their attack. Looking back on the clock, it is only a minute-and-a-half difference. So not the end of the world, but once again, when you're down in a position, you would like to be up on the clock. c4 is played, and bishop c3 is played. And now, we have an interesting development. The bishop is attacking the queen, as well as this pawn. But, depending on how things unfold, white could end up with an advantage. However, following this line with the bishop taking on b4, the rook taking on b4, and the queen taking on b4. White is simply down in the exchange and down another pawn. So now we see c5 played by white. This is a free pawn. We could see pawn takes. Queen takes is another possibility, but afterwards you might end up down. At the same time, we instead see queen takes on e4, as that is a hanging piece. But now we see c takes d6, e takes d6, and now black has blundered their rook. Once again, this game is not over. The players are losing pieces left and right. Black had a considerable advantage before, but now they are only up 4 pawns. Now, of course, in a Grandmaster game, 4 pawns would be the entire game. They would simply resign on the spot if they were down 4 pawns in a game like this. But in a game of this level, you never know. Especially when the black king is still in the center of the board. If we could see something like the rook developing to e1 and the queen having an attack on a4, you never know. Black could be checkmated. However, with the black queen coming to e2, it certainly seems like we may be reaching a territory where the game will begin to slow down. Black will slowly push their advantage. We see queen c1, and now queen e4, once again putting the white king in check. However, if black doesn't find a plan, we may end up with a draw by repetition. And now, unless black makes a different move, we will in fact see a draw. Of course, black does not want that. They are up 4 pawns, and so they're going to have to figure out another plan. And now we're seeing some development. We see g5 followed by f3, and now queen at d4. See king h1 and g4. Now we see f4, and the engine is really having a hard time comprehending what is happening in this position right now. There is a lot to unpack, and players seem to be making blunders left and right, but they're making moves quickly, potentially trying to keep their clocks up, but that makes it more difficult for them to see blunders. And now, once again, we've reached an interesting position. We could see queen c8 checking the king and taking that rook. However, instead, we see h4. And this could lead to checkmate for white. But now we see queen d4 once again putting the white king into check. It seems to be black's favorite move, checking the opposing king. Once again, with this rook eyeing down this file, the pawn pushing, and the queen eyeing the king, we could see white being checkmated soon. Now, black moves their rook out of danger from being skewered. However, there are still some dangers. And here we go. We see queen c8, king a7, queen takes b7, king e6, and this f5 would be a fork between the black king and the black rook. If white finds this move, they would actually be in a very winning position. Instead, we see queen takes a6. Now, important to keep in mind, this fork is still on the table, so even though white did not play it, if black does not properly respond, they would still find themselves in danger of facing it. Both players are getting decently low on the clock. White has 2.5 minutes left, black almost has 3.5 minutes left, but they've still maintained their time advantage throughout the entire game. So even if they do lose their rook, it is possible they could win on time. Now we have rook to h6, moving out of the fork, but the position is becoming less and less clear. White was down 4 pawns before, but now they're only down 2 pawns. And this black rook is not exactly in the best position. It can't exactly move anywhere. It still can take this pawn, which would be dangerous for white, considering it would put white into check. But if white can find a proper response, they may be able to hold the position together. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. White's now down 2 minutes on the clock. They're running very low on time. Only a minute and a half left. Now, these players do have 5-second increment, so they can live off of the increment if they need to. And now, this is a very good move. It puts white into a position to potentially capture this pawn and protect, the h4 pawn if black allows it to happen, which I believe they must. The king cannot go to f5 because it is under attack by the queen. And so it must go to f6. And now, suddenly, white is in an extremely winning position. But it may not be entirely obvious why. I believe it could be something along the lines... Well, here we go. We'll just go ahead and look at queen g4. And now, white is potentially gluing this position together. Black still has the win if they play it properly, but white has managed to regain 3 pawns, but it is also at the price of their time. They're still down 2 minutes on the clock, and black has 3 minutes. It is still very dangerous for white. If they aren't able to play precisely and quickly, they can still easily lose the game. But the same can be said for black. If they lose their time advantage, who knows what will happen. See queen d4, king h1. What will happen? We see d5 pushing the pawn, attempting to make a queen. But we now have, once again, a forking tactic. Queen g5 protected by these pawns, forking the black king and the black rook. Black has nowhere to go except for e6, and after taking the rook, once again the king will be in check. Instead, we see queen d7, leaving this pawn unprotected, and black takes. We now see king g2 from white, and white is running very low on the clock. 47 seconds left. And their king is now in imminent danger. We see queen e4. Where will the king go? I expect king g3 is the best move, attacking the rook and also protecting this pawn, and the pawn is also protected by the rook, so the queen cannot take it. Additionally, the black king is really stuck. The pawn is preventing it from coming to these two squares, and the white king is preventing it from coming to either of these squares. We could see an interesting situation where both players are trying to avoid checkmate at the same time. However, white's clock continues to trickle down. 20 seconds. They must move quickly within the last few moves of the game, otherwise they will lose the game on time. Another check by white, trying to buy time. Maybe trying to confuse black. If black makes a wrong move, they could still step into checkmate. Black thinking. Doesn't want to make a fatal blunder when they have so much time on the clock. They have plenty of time to think and calculate. King g7. The king is now looking relatively safe. It's very difficult for white to attack black now. They play queen c3, but now f6 is played. I was expecting d4 was also possible. Now we see queen f3. Now if I were black, I would potentially consider trading queens here. You're up 2 pawns and plenty of time on the clock. At the same time, keeping queens on the board could allow you to get a considerable time advantage. However, black blunders the rook. And now, according to the engine, the game is drawn. Both rooks off the board, but white takes this pawn. And now, it's a 1 pawn to 2 pawn advantage, and it isn't entirely obvious how either player can win the game. I will point out, black did have a win there. When the king went to f3, if queen h1 was played, that would be a skewer on the white king. However, instead, we see this being played. And white actually had a way to win the game by simply taking black's queen, but that was not played. Instead, white was too low on the clock and really was just unable to make it happen, which is understandable. When you don't have a lot of time on the clock, making mistakes is only natural. And we are likely to see white be checkmated here soon in a few moves. Potentially black will even just make another queen to make it that much easier. Although, if black makes a wrong move here, white is in stalemate territory. But no, black delivers a check. Now we have king f2. And this game is all but over. White's king has plenty of squares to move to. No stalemate in sight yet. But we could get there soon if black is not careful. But now, you'll be seeing a checkmate shortly. Almost certainly. And there we go. Black wins the game.